Welcome to StablePod, the podcast that explores the exciting world of decentralized systems and beyond. Join us as we delve into the limitless possibilities of decentralized governance, decentralized finance, and decentralized organizations with the most creative and innovative minds in the space. We'll hear from trailblazers who are building, shaping, and maintaining the future of these decentralized systems. From DAOs to NFTs, DeFi to Web3, we cover it all on StablePod. Alrighty, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of StablePod. I'm your host, Juan Esquivel. I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Gustav Ehrentoft. How are you feeling today, Gustav?
Very good. I mean, it's Christmas soon, so that's always good.
Totally. Today's guest can be described as a leading figure in the world of governance design. Justine is governance architect and core contributor at the Optimism Foundation, where they play a crucial role in stewarding the Optimism Collective towards decentralization. Welcome to the podcast, Justine.
Thanks for having me.
I'd love to start things off by discussing some of this awesome research you've put together, digging into policies and processes at DAOs. What were some of the key findings from your research?
Yeah, so one of the kind of core things to the approach we take at Optimism is obviously experimentation, but also that we try to inform design, not just based on delegate feedback, but also research. And some of that's interdisciplinary, so about political science systems, game theory, etc. What I focus on mostly is looking at what other DAOs have done, which we actually have a really amazing ability to do because most things are just published on the forum. Like the level of transparency is a unique characteristic of DAOs that allows us to learn a lot about their evolution, what has worked and hasn't worked. If you're crazy enough, like I am, to dig through all these forums and read all of this stuff, it's actually kind of amazing what lives out there in the open. It's not gated, like anybody can access these resources. So the first kind of research project I did, which we open sourced in something called the Collective Archives, was to read thousands of forum posts and kind of map out the evolution of roughly 20 DAOs. I don't remember exactly how many at this point, and try to find some common patterns. I feel like at least a couple of years ago, the discourse around DAOs was very focused on how they're all unique and they're idiosyncratic and each one is different because it's accomplishing a different goal. And that's all true. But there are also pretty identifiable patterns that we can find in these systems as well. All of this is linked on my Twitter, which is at Lala Lavender, if you want to access the resources for yourself. But some of the takeaways that were maybe most meaningful or surprising to me, I think one was the importance of maintaining legitimacy. And Vitalik has a few great articles about this, but basically the legitimacy of a DAO is created within the DAO itself. So if that is ever put into question, the DAO can collapse. So that's kind of like an existential threat. So this is a thing that we think about a lot at the foundation whenever we have to make a decision or implement a new process or make a call in the million of edge cases that always come up in DAOs. We want to try to never do anything that jeopardizes the legitimacy of the governance system or process itself.
So just quickly here, legitimacy, I think is maybe not like a clearly defined concept here. Can you just explain to us what you mean with legitimacy?
Yes. So Vitalik has an article where he outlines 6 sources of legitimacy. But if I had to define what I mean by legitimacy itself, it's basically that the members of the DAO can rely on governance outcomes to be upheld, right? They can basically believe in the governance system itself as a system that has integrity, and not that they will have one input and get an unexpected output.
Okay, so kind of like ensuring that there's accountability for the votes or like the decisions that the community takes actually gets executed, right?
Yes, it's many things. It's reliability of the process. It's guarantees that governance outcomes will be enacted and things like that.
So besides legitimacy, was there any other key takeaways that you maybe found surprising or?
Yeah, another one that I think about a lot is making this distinction between representatives in the DAO and contributors in the DAO. And so in some of the earlier DAOs, it was common to kind of elect all positions, but then you have this model where you're like kind of getting publicly hired and fired and maybe negotiating your salary publicly, et cetera, which can be kind of a brutal process to go through if you're what I would call a contributor, somebody doing work. Like imagine you're just setting up a merch store, but you're being treated as a public official, right? So there's kind of that level of public scrutiny and accountability is important if you're a representative of the DAO, which I'll define in a second. But I think it's not needed, it's unnecessary, and it creates negative dynamics if you're doing it for people that are contributors to the DAO. So what I mean by representative and when those people should be elected is if token holders are delegating rights or responsibilities they would otherwise do themselves to somebody else in the DAO. And so that's why we have a grants council. Those people are elected because they're making decisions about what happens with the governance fund. Otherwise, every delegate would do that themselves. We also have a security council, which enacts upgrades that otherwise another party would do. So it's important that those be elected representatives.
So perhaps related to that, do you distinguish in what you just described service providers from contributors?
A service provider is a type of contributor, basically. I mean, there's different DAOs use different terminology, right? But I think that as we grow the collective and the number of core devs and the number of external teams that are helping us scale execution that right now OP Labs and the foundation does, we will have more external parties or service providers or whatever you want to call them providing services to the DAO. In my opinion, this is a more functional model than having working groups within the DAO, but I'm pretty strongly anti-working group and not everybody's on board with that.
Yeah, I have a question I wanted to ask later on regarding that, but we could touch on that a little bit later. Coming back to the research, something we care a lot about at Stable Lab is, standardizing governance frameworks more frequently and more often within the DAOs we work in. During the course of your research, you did highlight some of the policies you came across. Why do you think there are still so few of these? Or maybe you think we made a lot of progress here?
Yeah, I think that we see, I could separate this into kind of two categories. One being like guidelines and frameworks that allow you to create strategic alignment. That in the early days, we didn't see a lot of. Now you see more of it. Things like a mission statement, maybe a vision statement, quarterly goals, OKRs, KPIs, whatever different people call them, different things. We have something called intents, which is a way to achieve strategic alignment. That I think is now more understood that it's needed to provide high level direction to the DAO. Otherwise it will go in every which way, basically. I think there's still a tension or we're still trying to figure out kind of collectively what the right balance is between providing guidance or having guidelines and letting things be more emergent. And that's kind of a delegate balance to try to find. I think on the other side or the other category of things, in this category of standardized processes, et cetera, you also see some DAOs that really like over governance or like have overly defined processes and basically results in kind of like something that looks like corporate bureaucracy. And so I think, at least in the early development of DAOs, you kind of saw over-index towards defining processes and bureaucracy and an under-index towards focusing on things like strategic alignment. I think it's reversing now and people understand that you need the strategic alignment is very important and you don't want to overburden the DAO with a bunch of process, basically.
I think here, describing the early experience of Maker, very precisely, where you could do anything you wanted, but certain aspects of the DAO, if you wanted to do things under them, you were going into these very, very these processes were just filled with friction, and it just turned out to be extreme bottlenecks. So I'm just curious, when you've been looking at these DAOs here, how are you like differentiating the vertical of the DAOs? Because I think we're also seeing a very big difference compared to like, how, Optimism as an L2 or other L2s compared to something like, Maker and Aave, which is, I would say like the very, yeah, it still requires quite a bit of bureaucracy because they are dealing with some topics that has a lot of impact for the end user. And then, some of the more, I would say, like loosely governed places, like a place like Uniswap, where, they don't really regulate anything on the protocol level, but just, run programs. So how are you kind of like looking at these things as like from a vertical perspective? And is there like any differences or differentiation that you do in like your analysis there?
Yeah. Yes. So all those types of DAOs will look different. An application layer DAO will look very different than the governance of an L1 or of other L2s. All the L2 DAOs, including ourselves, are early. So there's not as much history to look at. Some of them don't have a token yet, et cetera. And so there's also just less public information available about how those systems are operating. But I look at what is available in those cases. And then I think we just have to kind of make the adjustment in the I think it's really hard to try to like look at 20 DAOs and then come up with an average or a statement about. Yes, I think it would be very dilutive to like try to average something across all of these DAOs and not take into account these differences. And so there are definitely structures or different ways that things are designed that would make sense for an application layer DAO and not an L2. And that's just kind of an adjustment that we have to know. Luckily, we have the context to understand pretty well what would make sense for our ecosystem or not. But there are important differences. I think also we have the luxury of being able to kind of pick and choose different parts as we design. So you can have a DAO like Synthetics and the Graph and Starknet. Those are three totally different types of DAOs and ecosystems, but they all kind of have a body that is tasked with making or helping the DAO make technical decisions. And so that's kind of the layer of abstraction, which also would make sense for Optimism as an L2 to have somebody that helps make technical decisions. And then you can look at those three different structures that each of those DAOs use and pick and choose what makes sense for our particular ecosystem. So that's kind of the approach that we use.
Justine, you mentioned that you're basically trailblazing what L2 governance, you're defining it as we go, what that looks like. I'm curious what do you look like, or what do you look towards for like inspiration, for knowledge sharing, especially, considering that L2 governance, like you just illustrated, is so unique?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, I talk to a lot of the other governance leads at other foundations and in other ecosystems. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say this or not, but like I got coffee with a big Arbitrum delegate the other day, et cetera. I don't think that we should be competing against each other, right? The truth is that we all have to figure out how to make DAOs that work for the sake of this whole industry. And so we should all work together to do that. A big part of our ethos is open source. Any of the research that I do, I'm just another huge kind of chunk of research where we just share that with everybody. And then I think that helps the whole ecosystem move forward faster. And in the end, that will benefit all of us because all of us that are trying to operate DAOs need them to work.
Yeah, I think that's the same ethos we carry as like delegates and service providers in the space. Like we kind of rely on each other. If there's not more of us, then what's kind of the point of everything we're doing? We need others to kind of also jump in and contribute. I want to shift over the conversation now to the foundation itself. As the first hire of the foundation, I believe you're one of the first hires. What has changed the most since its inception? Yeah,
this is a fun question. So I was the first external hire for sure. So I joined the foundation when it was Ben and Jing and Liv. And there was no job description. There was no bank account. I mean, like there was basically nothing. There was a post on Twitter that said, we're launching the collective and we're hiring. And I had been working with Rabbit Hole on their meta governance experiment before this. And I had interviewed at a bunch of DAOs. So as soon as I saw the Optimism Foundation launch, I was sure that is was the thing that I wanted to work on. I thought they were taking a really innovative approach to try to solve some of the most serious challenges that DAOs face. So I got in touch with them and I joined, and there was no JD. They were like, maybe you'll be Ben's chief of staff. And I was like, okay, whatever you need me to do, like, let's just build this basically. So a lot has changed now. The team is, I don't know how many people, 10 or 12 and growing. And there's stuff that's happening that I don't even know is happening. There's people that are in the Discord and in the Slack that I don't know again. So I think that's kind of a cool measure when, I used to be the only person, so I knew everything that was happening because I was doing everything. And now there's entire initiatives that I'm not even aware of before anyone else is, and I see them on Twitter and I learn about them at the same time. But I think that we are also being very intentional about how we grow the foundation versus empower the community to do things, because I think it's well known, it's in the working constitution, that the role of the foundation is temporary. We're basically serve a bootstrapping mechanism over multiple years to set the system up and then go away, basically, or to take on a very different and less involved role. So as we kind of grow the foundation, we keep this in mind, and we don't want to build up big foundation to then dissolve it later.
I think I just have a question here, because I think it's like the approach that you take here is kind of like, I think the space now has started to also favor like a little bit of a different methodology, right? Where we see, you give like the DAO some responsibility areas, but like I think that we also feel there's a lot in our work, right? That there's a lot of the foundations or labs, or what you want to call the different organizations behind the DAOs, who are really reluctant to decentralize too much, right? I think like some people have seen, kind of like what happened around some of the projects that this a bit too fast. And I would even say that, quite a lot of the even like very big projects that we see out there has kind of like completely removed it from their mission to even try to become like a full on DAO, right? But it's like, hey, we build like a centralized business that kind of like sits next to it and owns parts of the technology and so on. So I just kind of like wanted to kind of like hear your perspective on this, because, you were in a similar situation I was in a couple of years ago when, I was at Maker, and, we were basically working, and if we were successful, we would be out of a job. And that's kind of like a little bit the same proposition that you have now. The better a job you do, the faster you will be out of a job. So kind of like, maybe just like your thoughts around that, and then also kind of like your perspective on kind of like these two major directions that we're seeing for like the DAOs in the space.
Yes, definitely. This is a good question, and also one of those questions of finding the right balance. So I think right now we are intentionally decentralizing and setting up the system slowly and iteratively and doing experiments, et cetera, over multiple years. So I think we know that decentralizing too fast is a failure mode of some DAOs, right? Just kind of like turning everything over into anarchy hasn't gone very well in the past. So we're trying to do it a little, play the role of bootstrapping while developing community leadership. So if you look at this season, we now have, I think, it's over 30, I don't remember the exact number, but elected or appointed positions in the DAO, which are community members. So that's awesome, because those are all basically people playing roles that are leadership roles in the community. And that's important to establish that gradually, so that as we play less of that role, there are strong people that take on those responsibilities. There's also another way. I think we're used to thinking about decentralizing as like cutting a pizza into more slices. This is someone else's analogy on our team, but I'm borrowing it. You can also decentralize by adding more pizzas. So what does that mean? Like if we add more core dev, we can take a core dev team and slice it up into the DAO, or we can add more core dev teams, and you're still less reliant on the original core dev team, for example. You can add more external teams that build things. You can add more delegates that are decision makers, et cetera. And so I think that's another model, which if you think about our ecosystem and the fact that we're going to have many OP chains, that's another way to decentralize. It's just get more people around the table, more people involved in decision making. I think it's functional, this kind of service provider model where you have, especially dev teams, et cetera, that kind of operate as a more centralized entity that provides services to the DAO, but you have options, multiple core dev teams or multiple service providers, or you have competitive RFP processes, et cetera. And so this is a long way of saying there are multiple ways to achieve decentralization that don't require everything to, quote, dissolve into the DAO and everyone is this is kind of the old model of everyone is this contributor that's being elected and all that kind of thing.
So perhaps related to what you just said, what you just described, this transition of power over to the community, do you have like an internal roadmap? Do you have like an internal strategy framework within the team, within the foundation? Or is it just through these initiatives, like these various councils, these various like things you introduce to the community to get to that point of transitioning, power further?
Yes, we have multiple frameworks and roadmaps we use. So obviously OP Labs has an engineering framework focused on technical decentralization. At the foundation, we have kind of a roadmap that's different decentralization milestones. The roadmap I'm responsible for is when we bring different parts of the governance system online. So we have something called an operating manual, and in there are outlined different proposal types that are live. That is a fraction of the full set of governance responsibilities that the DAO will be responsible for at the end of this multi-year period. And so I'm responsible for the roadmap of when we bring what online, and then that determines, okay, what structures do we need to be able to support making those types of decisions? Maybe we need a developer advisory board to be able to support all these protocol upgrades or the sequencer allow list process or whatever it is. Or if we're going to make decisions about sequencer revenue, maybe we need some budget board or treasury council or something that can help the DAO think through some of those parameters, et cetera. Jonas, who's the Retro PGF lead, for sure has a roadmap about how the evolution of Retro PGF rounds, what that will look like. And then we also have kind of a joint house roadmap, which means like talking about when we have both the Citizens House and the Token House voting together on things. It's a really complex system to try to have two houses. I get kind of a lot of questions about, have you thought of like a triumvirate model or like adding a third judicial branch or like basically like making this system somehow more complicated? And I think there's maybe an underappreciation of how challenging it is to just create a bicameral system that works.
Yeah, I think it's very tricky, right? If you start to incorporate more complexity into the system. I feel like a lot of people always have like all these great ideas, but it's like in practice, some ideas just don't work.
Yeah, but I think like I really like, what Rune, Kristen, from Maker says there. He's like, because they get the same problem, right? Like people are like, why are you doing this super complicated? And he's like, I mean, it's not supposed to be simple, right? It's supposed to be like a video game where like the first day you sit down and play it, you're like, what is going on? I don't understand anything. But, if you continue to play it, then you're kind of like unlocking more and more. And that like, there's also kind of like this like reward mechanism that like the better you understand the system, the more rewarding it can also be for you, both on like a personal level, intellectually or something, but also potentially from like a financial standpoint with you basically unlocking like more opportunities. So you don't really get like so much of kind of like just like the surface, graft people trying to extract value, because frankly, they're not possible.
But the problem with that analogy real quick is that there's a never ending like DLC. There's never ending new content. And the devs are like everyone. And so everyone's just creating new world environments in this analogy. Sorry, Justine, were you going to add something?
No, I think one of the things that Bobby at the foundation always pushes me on in the design of things is to simplify. And I would say over the course of seasons, each season we've introduced additional complexity just because we're introducing additional functionality. And then the next season, you can see us try to simplify because it creates a barrier to grant recipients, to new delegates, to new voters, to anyone trying to navigate the system. And sometimes that might be intentional and it might be beneficial to have those barriers, like you're saying, to prevent whatever people applying to drain the treasury, basically. But complexity if there's too much complexity, it can also be a form of capture, and that only the person that's designed the system knows how to use it or to navigate it, and it can be captured then by the architect, and we're intentionally trying to avoid that. I'm saying that as a person who is the architect. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, of course, it is to strike, like some kind of balance, but also at the same time, I mean, what you guys are building is extremely ambitious, right? And of course, like what will end up over time becoming the more and more controlling mechanisms of this, like, very ambitious system should also, have, I mean, in my opinion, some barrier to entry, right? Like, I think that, we sometimes kind of like talk about governance of these protocols as something, which is kind of like should be almost as easy as like joining like a Discord server or like a Telegram channel. And I don't always believe that should be the case, right? I think that there's like definitely some aspects of like governance, which, is like really complicated, and, the way that we interact with those systems are often also just reflection of kind of the complexity that we're dealing with in the decisions themselves.
Yes, I think for governance minimization is in our constitution as one of our principles. And so I think you can also achieve that by reducing the number of parameters that are kind of open to governance or to human decision making. So I think we want to think about things in the future like smart defaults, where you can intentionally deviate from something that is maybe determined formulaically or according to some framework if you consciously choose to, but otherwise it will default to something. If you look at how we think about the Citizens House and having basically a graph of attestations that we can do computations on, I think this is another way to kind of eliminate some of the weaknesses or abuses that can happen in other DAOs when it's just fully like anybody can come in and start determining outcomes, is to use data and automation and kind of minimize the attack surface of that, basically.
I want to get into maybe now more details regarding some of these initiatives we've been describing. So we're currently in reflection period for season 4. We're getting ready for season 5. I'd love to hear from where you were standing from, the Optimism Foundation. What were some of the most important lessons you guys learned from season 4? Yeah,
I think it was actually going to be so in season 4, we introduced the concepts of intents, which are basically goals that everything that the DAO is doing is meant to support, and then missions that work towards those intents. So a mission is any initiative that a contributor, internal or external, thinks will help further the collective towards that goal. The concepts were understood well. The process around it was complicated and confusing for everybody. I would say generally the feedback we get about optimism governance is, this is well thought through, it's experimental, it's iterative, you're trying new things, it's innovative, whatever. The flip side to that is it changes all the time. It's super confusing. I can't navigate it. I don't understand what's happening. And so that definitely was an aspect of the new things that we introduced in season 4. And so I think the main thing we did in season 5 was, again, just try to simplify the process around that. And then we also had to introduce a whole bunch of new stuff for various reasons, but in part to support this concept of the Superchain. So that's things like the chain delegation program. The Security Council plays an important role in our Superchain future. The Law of Chains, which is a big governing document related to the Superchain. So in the reflection period, we had to introduce a lot of new things. And we always try to be conscious also of just delegate time, attention, energy, and ability to understand 20 new initiatives at one time, and try not to overwhelm everyone.
I think the comms. I think the comms are great. I think you guys do a good job of conveying and the information with it through different initiatives and also community initiatives, right? Community born from the contributors are also doing a really good job of trying to distill this information, and so it just takes the person, take the time to catch up. I wanted to ask about the Superchain, because I think this will be a pretty massive, important, moment, and when we look back at the governance timeline for Optimism. Could you maybe explain what this is? Also the law of chains, right? As it's related to that. Maybe could you explain what this is for the listener that maybe is not keeping up as close to Optimism?
Yes, definitely. So the OP stack is open source, so anybody can always fork the code and create their own chain. There's also the concept of a super chain, which is basically one chain that enacts kind of joint upgrades at the same time. And then the chains that are part of it make certain commitments to the collective, which is to uphold the law of chains, which I'll explain in more detail. There's part of it, which is a commitment for some portion of their revenue to go back towards retro PGF to sustain the ecosystem. And then there's some other guarantees that these chains that participate in the super chain make. Eventually, the super chain will have things like, or may have things like shared messaging and shared sequencing, et cetera. But for now, it will be governed by the Security Council, so that the protocols are enacted basically simultaneously across the chains, and that process is governed by the OP token, so by the Optimism Collective, essentially. The law of chains is a specific document which has been ratified by the Token House that outlines guarantees to users and chain operators and other important stakeholders in the ecosystem about how these chains will and won't operate. And so if a chain violates the law of chains, Optimism governance can remove them from the super chain.
So you mentioned the Security Council, and I think Optimism is quite known for using this council model frequently. How do we begin to think, or how do you think about how we combat capture resistance of like these governance initiatives and designs?
Yeah, so to date, we've only had one council, which is the Grants Council, but it's worked well in when we first started, every token holder voted on every grant application, and it was super chaotic and the delegates were extremely overwhelmed. So we moved to this council model. We've introduced a Security Council. I think we don't want to have more than around 5 councils or boards. A board is slightly different. They just advise, they don't make decisions themselves, whereas a council actually has decision-making power. Important in making sure the councils themselves are not captured are the level of transparency that's required of the councils. So they all have to publish on the forum internal operating procedures, so the delegates can understand if they are not operating according to those procedures, which is a commitment. The charters of all the persistent councils are hosted on GitHub. So again, everybody can see what are the expectations of members, and are they fulfilling their mandate? And then we have a code of conduct that these members are also bound to. If they're not abiding by any of those 3 things, council members can be removed at any time, and that's a very important accountability mechanism. We have an open election process, meaning anybody can nominate themselves. What we saw with the Grants Council was that we had a lot of people nominate themselves this time, which was great. I think we had like 26 or so nominations for 13 spots. The people that had served on the council before had a pretty big lead against any of the kind of new nominees. And so in the future, we could consider something like term limits if we're worried that the councils are becoming entrenched and membership is not able to change. we haven't officially implemented anything like that now, but it's something delegates have suggested, and it's definitely an option.
Yeah, totally. I do want to call it the time. I know you have a hard stop. I just have a couple more questions for you. Looking ahead to 2024, what's in store for the collective? What are some of the key new initiatives that you guys have outlined that will be introduced in season 5 and season 6?
Yeah, so season 5 is, I think, big focus is on kind of bringing Superchain governance online. So standing up the Security Council, have that actually govern multiple chains, which comprise the Superchain, and creating the process around the sequencer allow list. So adding other sequencers to the Superchain. The other major thing we have to do is have Citizens House start doing governance. So citizens to date have been allocating retro PGF, but they haven't actually done a governance vote or voted on a protocol upgrade, et cetera. So they will gain veto rights on protocol upgrades in season 5. And then I know that Jonas is thinking a lot about the roadmap for retro PGF and what do different rounds look like and how often are we having rounds and what does the voting in rounds look like. And there are a lot of parameters there. So I think those are kind of the biggest focuses for 2024. There, for sure will be other things that we introduce. It's a DAO, so we kind of take things as they come also. You can't fully anticipate, but those are pretty large projects.
Yeah, totally. Exciting. I had so much more questions I wanted to ask you, Justine, but we will let you go. Any final thoughts or comments? Anything you want to plug as we wrap?
I would say get involved in Optimism governance if you aren't already. It's very important for us to increase votable supply, which is the amount of tokens that are able to cast a vote, and to distribute that voting power among many delegates. I feel very lucky with the delegates that we have, in that they're very engaged and committed and super willing to iterate and experiment with us. But we just need to get more people involved. So the best way to do that is to go to vote.optimism.io. And register. And then if you go in the Discord, somebody will point you in the right direction.
Any final thoughts, Gustav?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds really exciting, everything that is going on at Optimism, right? And I think it's so cool how much emphasis you put on doing governance. I mean, I wouldn't say the right way, because what is even the right way? But something which objectively looks like some really good initiatives. So yeah, really excited to see everything that's going to be happening over the coming years with you guys.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that I think Optimism is being very thoughtful about what they're aiming to accomplish, and that they lean into their community a lot, and that's something people should be paying attention to. And if you have ideas, and jump into the forums. So yeah, we're also excited to continue to contribute over there. Thank you so much for joining us, Justine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gustav. We'll see you on the next episode of Stable Pod.